Hi there, it's Mr. Clark. Welcome to lesson 5.1.4 on simple Anacruses. So, if you have a piece that starts with a little bit of music before the first downbeat, that is in common parlance called a pickup or an upbeat. Or, if you want to be fancy and use fancy words, Anacruses, or the plural would be Anacruses. So, it would look something like this, where you have your first full measure here, that's your first downbeat, your beat one, but there's a little bit of music before it. So the way you would say this is, well, if you have 1/8 note at the end of a measure, 1D to D, you'd say D. So you figure out what that would be at the end of the measure. So this rhythm would be D1, D2, D1 ka, me 2, 1 ka D, D, D2. So the only new concept here is this first anacrusis or pickup is D. In older notation, you would say, hey, I have this single eighth note at the beginning of the piece, so I have to borrow that from somewhere, so I'm borrowing it from the end of the piece. So this last measure would have one fewer eighth note of time, so like 1, 2, 3 instead of 4 eighth notes. But that's an old thing. We don't do that anymore. So this is not really an eraser. So when you're writing music, that's not something you need to worry about, but if you see an incomplete measure at the end of a piece of music, especially if it's older, that's what's going on. So, let's find a couple more examples. Oh, hey, I found some examples. So, example number 1, right there, we have a quarter note pickup. So, if you have a quarter note at the end of a 2/4 measure, that's going to be 2. So you would say 2, 1, D1, D me 2, me 1, D1 ka, me 2. At the end of a 3/4 measure, if you have a quarter note, it's going to be 3. So that one would be 3, 1, D me 2, 3 ka D, 1 ka D me 2 ka, 3, D, D, 3 ka D me 1 D, me 3. At the end of a 4/4 measure, 4 D1. A half note at the end of a 2/2 measure, well, there are two big beats, generally, that are both half notes, so that would be 2-1, me 2 ka D. And here, with the 2/4 measure, you have an eighth note, which is the same, this is actually literally the same example from the textbook. So that's what's going on here. Go ahead and practice writing and counting these anacruses before the first downbeats, and I will see you next time.